When I teach my introductory to philosophy courses, I insist on teaching it in a chronological manner. We start from the beginning and we progress through time. I did an episode about this earlier because it really is important for students to be able to understand philosophy by understanding how it evolves through time, how subsequent philosophers build on earlier philosophers. One of the questions that students who are paying attention anyway often ask me at a certain point several weeks into the course is, how is it that these older philosophers don't understand the reality of human individual experience? And I say, well, you have to be patient because that does not develop until surprisingly late. We have to wait until the 1800s for philosophers to start to really fully awaken to that reality that, hey, everyone is an individual and everyone has individual perceptions and individual beliefs and therefore individual perspectives on life. And this awareness, this realization by this small group of philosophers happened at a particular time and place because of a long tradition of philosophy that led up to it, most specifically by a particular philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and this movement known as German idealism that took these ideas of Kant has affected not only philosophy, but all of our culture. I'm very fond of saying that there are two eras in philosophy, before Kant and after Kant. And that's very true because of what Kant did. Kant opened a door with his revolutionary insight that our perceptions conform to our mental structure. He called it the categories of understanding, and I did another episode video on this. The implication of Kant's new doorway toward understanding human perception was that reality conforms to our minds. And our minds are more than just purely passive perceivers. You look at the British empiricists, John Locke being the most notable ones, they saw the mind as completely passive. Stuff just happens to it, stuff enters our minds, and the minds just react. Or even the horrible thing of Hobbes is, well, we don't even have free will, we don't do anything. It's just stuff happens. It's like some sort of movement of bodies, little particles in our mind. But Kant realized, no, that doesn't work. It doesn't explain humanity. It doesn't explain how humans act and how humans do. Our minds, Kant says, are active in our experiences. And the structure of our minds structures our experiences. But it was in the early 1800s that a group of German philosophers, thinkers, and artists pushed through that door that Kant had opened. And that was the movement known as German idealism. It's called German because it was discussed by a circle of German language philosophers and artists. And idealism because the movement argued that everything must be understood as being dependent on mental or spiritual reality. Now, don't confuse this with other types of thought that are called idealism. Berkeley was idealism because he didn't think that anything exists other than ideas. And there are various other forms of thought out there that have been called idealism. But the German idealism that we're talking about here is simply the idea that there is mental reality as the most important. Everything is dependent upon our mental or spiritual reality. And these thinkers thought this because Kant's Copernican revolution had placed the human mind at the center of philosophy, at the center of all human experience. But more important to the German idealists, this worldview positioned human individuals as the engines of creativity. The German idealists developed a unique philosophical movement. They synthesized earlier ideas into an approach to reality that greatly influenced the arts and, by extension, much of human society. It could be argued that this could only have happened in the German language lands at a certain time. It was the late 1700s and early 1800s that German-speaking culture was awakening to a fresh view of human expression. The thinkers in the German idealist movement were also open to new possibilities, and they were willing to take Kant's insights about human understanding, that we are active in our experience, and reassess everything in human experience. So these thinkers are asking a number of pertinent questions. If, as Kant showed, The mind is active in experience. Then the question is, how active? If our perceptions conform to some sort of mental structure that we have, then does that structure ever change? Do people in different cultures or different times have different mental structures? Now, Kant said we can't go beyond the categories of understanding, the structure of our perceptions. But is perception outside their limits really impossible? Are the categories really the same for every individual human being, as Kant says? Can we willfully change the way we experience the universe by changing our approach to it? The various thinkers in the German idealism movement crafted new philosophical approaches to the questions of what the universe is and what we can know about it. The essential theme within German idealism is the thought that reality is dependent on the mind of the perceiver. Therefore, when the perceiver changes his or her approach to the universe, that changes his or her understanding, and perhaps even his or her reality. This opens us up to the big questions of which approach will best reveal reality to us. Philosophers and artists gravitated into the German idealism movement to talk about the possibilities of new approaches that could lead to new perceptions and realizations. The German idealist thinkers rejected the limits that Kant had placed on human knowledge. The first limit is Kant's belief that human perception is limited to the unchanging categories of understanding, the structures of our mind. The second limit rejected by the German idealists is Kant's idea that there is a noumenal realm, the ultimate reality of the things in themselves, that is beyond our sense-based and rational knowledge. If there are limits to our sense perceptions of objects in the world, then there must, by logic, be a realm of reality beyond our knowledge. True, but the only way around that sound reasoning is to believe instead that human perception can transcend the limitations of the senses and Kant's categories of understanding. Along this line of thinking, the German idealists largely rejected the scientific approach to knowledge. They saw that approach as reductionist, reducing all phenomena to simplistic, categorical explanations. Such a limited approach to the universe was exactly what the German idealists wanted to transcend. In this push, they were influenced strongly by artistic movements at that time, mostly in literature. There is a large area between the limits of scientific knowledge and perfect knowledge, and the German idealists each staked their own claim in that territory. They each believed that our minds have the power of intuition that can transcend the limitations of science and reason and reveal the deeper reality of the universe. They argued that Kant and those who followed his system were limiting their understanding, believing they were cut off from reality beyond sense perception. The German idealists responded that what Kant called the noumenal realm is not actually beyond our reach. Common to the German idealists was their belief that the avenue to greater knowledge was to accept the inseparability of thinking and being. The German idealists saw reality as essentially mental, not like Berkeley's immaterialism, that nothing exists but mental substance, but reality as dynamic processes in which one's mental paradigm plays an active part. Thus, they were interested in overcoming the distinction between thought and being through connecting self-consciousness with the rest of reality. Some German idealists even flirted with the idea that our human understanding is, at least in theory, unlimited. To varying degrees, the German idealists rejected scientific and rationalist approaches to the universe and instead adopted an intuitive, passionate, and artistic approach. In this way, they shifted the focus of philosophy to the personal, to the individual. The artistic movement known as Romanticism was burgeoning in the 1790s, and armed with Kantian philosophy, the German idealists gave Romanticism intellectual power. Romanticism and German idealism both celebrated personal experience and supplemented, if not supplanted, rationality with emotional and spiritual experience. They combine the emphasis on personal experiences with a spiritual view of nature as a living force to be experienced with a sense of wonder rather than with science's dispassionate approach. It is easy to see how this personal approach encouraged creativity and individual expression, not just in philosophy and not just in art, but in all of human life. There were a number of German idealist thinkers, but I'm going to focus right now on one in particular who led the charge through the door that Kant had opened, and that was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Fichte's conviction was that Kant had only indicated the truth, but had neither fully explained it nor proved it. Kant's philosophy was critical in that he says that all of our beliefs are open to analysis. That, combined with the realization that the mind is active in experience, meant that we should critically analyze what goes into our experiences. We are capable of critically analyzing our perceptions and our beliefs by focusing our rational capacity on particular ideas within our mind. And Fichte took and ran with that idea. Kant has held that there is only one set of categories that structured human understanding that is universal to all people in all times and places. Fichte challenged that assumption. Fichte claimed that there is more than one way to perceive and make sense of the world. Kant had made the human mind the new center of epistemology by declaring that objects conform to the mind's rational structure. Fichte went further than Kant's Copernican revolution by saying that the categories employed by each individual person are what make the world meaningful. Philosophy, Fichte said, was not a dead piece of furniture, but something animated by the soul of the person who wields it. The world, Fichte says, is my world. I structure it. That means that my thoughts and values structure my experience. It also leads to the possibility that I can change the categories through which I understand the world. Fichte unfolded Kant's insights by centering his philosophy on the idea of freedom. In Fichte's view, freedom is a presupposition not only of actions, but also of human cognition, thinking itself. Our experiences of the world, of events happening beyond our control, are accompanied by the feeling of necessity, Fichte said. But there is also always the practical certainty of human freedom. Our decisions affect how we perceive and understand the world. This is one of the proofs of the reality of human free will. When we have experiences that happen beyond our control, we have that feeling of necessity that this thing is unfolding before us. But with that perception, that feeling, is also the feeling of I could do differently. I can be differently. I can think differently. I can act differently. How we are thinking affects how we perceive. We sense with every action that tension between necessity and freedom, our free will to do other than how the world is unfolding before us. So Fichte asks, what is the ground and meaning of our experience? He postulates that there are two alternatives. The first he calls dogmatism, an approach to the universe that assumes that the foundation of experience is an independent external reality. This approach interprets our inner experience as being determined by the outer world beyond our perception. That would be the Kantian noumena. This approach of dogmatism is assumed by the scientist and by both the rationalist and imperialist philosophers, both then and still now. In sharp contrast, Fichte advocates idealism. This is what idealism means for the German idealists. That finds the ground of experience in our own nature, our own self, so our human nature in general and the nature of our own individual self. This approach interprets the outer world in terms of our own inner experience. Fichte argues that if we limit ourselves to scientific knowledge, as the dogmatist does, We will see ourselves only as passive objects subject to the deterministic necessity of the material world that science believes in. For Fichte, the self is the foundation of experience. We have to begin with the self, he says, because we know our inner world of consciousness better than the outer world. Fichte argued that the only way we can experience objective reality is through self-positing. We begin from the certainty that we have an empirical consciousness. I am an I who asserts I am and can perceive and think about the world. The I is a self-positing activity that in its self-positing connects thought and being. That is Fichte's ground of certainty, and why he asserts that we have no thoughts and no actions that are not grounded in our continual activity of self-positing. To illustrate what he means, Fichte is reported to have once said to his students, "Gentlemen, think the wall." Then, "Gentlemen, think him who thought the wall." What he meant is that in addition to every object that appears to you, is your individual self, your I, that grounds those appearances. We have no experiences without a self-positing. You are part of your experiences. How we should view ourselves in the world is, for Fichte, an intensely important and practical question. Fichte thought that our beliefs cannot be proven by rational arguments. He said that what makes a belief viable is whether it positively affects our lives and our interests. This, of course, influenced American pragmatism in the 1900s. We choose our beliefs, Fichte says, based on their perceived value to us. The scientific method is not a given. It is not the only possible or even the best approach to the world. Facts are not beyond interpretation. Of course, people are free to choose to approach the universe scientifically, but those who choose this approach are doing so because they believe it serves their interests and makes the world more meaningful to them. They're still self-positing. Even science is based on subjective commitments and acts of practical faith. The conclusion that Fichte wants us to draw from his argument is that the world we live in is always a world structured by the way we approach it. Contemporary with and stimulated by the philosophy of German idealism, largely Fichte, was the artistic movement of Romanticism. This movement was an artistic expression of the active mind that can connect thought and being. At the heart of Romanticism was the vital importance of the artist's free expression. This was not a rational expression, but an emotional one. The artist's feelings are a law to themselves. An artistic creation should be free from rules dictating art's content or form. What the artist thinks and feels is what the artist creates. The nucleus of the Romantic movement was two brothers in Jena, Germany, August Wilhelm von Schlegel and Friedrich von Schlegel. Beginning in 1798, they published a philosophy of literature journal, which, though it only published 6 issues over 3 years, was influential in establishing Romanticism as an intellectual movement. That journal was the centerpiece of a circle of philosophers and artists in Jena, many of whom were professors at the city's university. They discussed and wrote about philosophy, religion, science, literature, and art. Notable members of the circle included Fichte, natural philosopher Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, philosopher of religion Friedrich Schleiermacher, poet and philosopher Friedrich Hölderlin, and literary critic Caroline Schlegel, who was married to August Schlegel until she divorced him in 1803 to marry Schelling when she became Caroline Schelling. Apparently, a little bit of a soap opera going on there. After the circle in Jena dispersed in 1804, after about 6 years, the center of the Romantic movement shifted to Coppet Castle in Switzerland, where Hermine de Staël, commonly referred to as Madame de Staël, held court. Madame de Staël had been educated in the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, famous French philosopher, and the legal theorist Baron de Montesquieu. Her mother had educated her in these two French writers, and her mother had hosted an influential Parisian salon, a salon just simply being a regular gathering of intellectuals, very common in French society in the 1700s. The younger de Staël followed her mother's footsteps, holding her own salon and writing about political philosophy. She used her social and political connections — her father was the French Minister of Finance and her husband the Swiss ambassador to France — to urge dialogue and moderation among the adversaries in the years of chaos that followed the French Revolution. That would be 1794 to 1799. De Staël opposed Napoleon, publishing a book of political philosophy and then a novel that argued against his absolutist ideology. And Napoleon responded in late 1803 by banishing de Staël from France. That was the impetus for her setting up a new salon in Coppet Castle, where she conversed with many dozens of intellectuals and politicians, including Napoleon's brother, who apparently wasn't very faithful to his brother, many of whom were or became leaders in academia, literature, or government. In her salon, de Staël learned about German idealism and Romanticism and became a patron and disseminator of both. She published the French-language book Die Allemagne, literally on Germany, in 1810, coining the term Romanticism, which we still use today. Yes, women have had a strong effect on philosophy and culture. The first printing of de Staël's book was destroyed by order of Napoleon himself. Remember, he was still angry at her. And he objected to de Staël's philosophical theories, but she managed to get it republished in London in 1813, after which it became very popular. In the book, de Staël introduced German idealism and Romanticism to the rest of Europe, and she advanced a progressive vision of society, combining the idea of limited government a la John Locke, individual expression, and liberal Christianity. Her views influenced modern ideas of religious liberty and tolerance within a secular society. It is a shame that her influence on philosophy, culture, and religion has been largely written out of history because she was a woman. Romanticism itself found natural expression in literature and music. Poets William Wordsworth, Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and John Keats were among the writers who immersed themselves in Romanticism. Many people are not aware that Ludwig van Beethoven's tremendous musical innovation was in part influenced by the incredible innovations occurring in German philosophy at that time. Beethoven knew several German idealist philosophers and corresponded with them. That is not to say that Beethoven was himself a philosopher. He produced no philosophical literature, preferring to do his thinking and being through music. Nevertheless, he was certainly influenced by the philosophers whom he knew and read. The cool thing about Beethoven is that he was the punk rock of his day. Yes, really, his Fifth Symphony is famous not only because of its sublime beauty, but because it shattered previous musical forms. In this and other compositions, Beethoven willfully disregarded convention and wrote music that expressed his emotions. In this, he captured the spirit of German Romanticism and German idealism. The last movement of his Ninth Symphony is a musical version of playwright Friedrich Schiller, also of the German idealist movement, who wrote a poem An die Freude, Ode to Joy. Beethoven revolutionized music. The Romantic poets revolutionized poetry. Madame de Staël revolutionized religious and political thought. All of this happened because of the long tradition of philosophy, dating way, way back to the ancient times, changed, if not completed, by Immanuel Kant, who opened the door to the idea that we contribute to our own perceptions of the world. So when students early in my course ask me, what about individual perspectives? What about subjectivity? Don't these philosophers realize that we all have different perceptions? I tell them, be patient, wait. It was the German idealists who opened that door. It was Kant who opened that door. It was German idealists who barged through it. And they set in motion trends that are still evolving and unfolding today of a growing awareness and realization that every single human being contributes to their own experiences because they approach the world by their own free will choices of how they respond to the things that are happening around them. It's not so daft a notion, and yet some people still fight against it. Yes, we have free will. We can choose how we approach the universe, and that changes who we are and how we live. And a lot of that goes back to a small group of philosophers in the early 1800s in Germany and Switzerland.